The idea of creating a truly multi-role floatplane had been on the minds of Japanese admirals since the mid-1930s. They dreamed of an aircraft that could act as a fighter, a dive bomber, and a shipboard scout all at the same time. Over time, this desire turned into a full-blown obsession, and you have to admit, Japanese designers came incredibly close to pulling it off. The seaplanes developed in the late 1930s fell just a little short of being considered truly multi-role. For example, the Mitsubishi F-1M2 floatplane did a great job as a shipboard gunfire spotter, a dive bomber, and even a light fighter. However, its range was simply too short for it to be a dedicated reconnaissance aircraft. Realizing this, the Imperial Japanese Navy's Aviation Bureau was forced to urgently scramble for an alternative. They were basically playing catch-up. That is how the order for a dedicated long-range shipboard scout came about. This resulted in the three-seat Aichi E16A1 floatplane. It entered mass production at the end of 1940. Jumping ahead a bit, it is important to point out that both of these aircraft served highly successfully throughout the entirety of World War II. They operated extensively from both coastal bases and the decks of almost every major warship in the Imperial Japanese Navy. When it came to combat performance, they absolutely held their own against Allied aircraft. But the naval aviation leadership was still unsatisfied. The airplanes just lacked that highly sought-after versatility. The elegant F-1M2 biplane could successfully intercept enemy flying boats or patrol bombers. But going toe-to-toe in a dogfight with dedicated fighters was just beyond its capabilities. Plus, its light armament could not inflict serious damage on enemy aircraft. Allied fighters had gotten significantly heavier and better armored by the middle of the war. This biplane could drop bombs in a dive, but simply could not carry heavy ordnance. On the other hand, the E16A1 monoplane easily carried bombs weighing up to 250 kilograms. It could continuously patrol the skies for up to 10 hours. However, it could not dive bomb at all. It became an absolutely helpless target the second enemy fighters appeared on the horizon. In 1939, the final pre-war year, the Naval Command issued a new technical specification under the 14 Sure designation. Among other things, this document called for the development of two new types of floatplanes. The first project involved developing a specialized seaplane for coordinating with submarines. It was meant to be based on a unique type of warship, a submarine squadron flagship. The requirements for this floatplane sounded like pure fantasy for the time. The new aircraft had to be fast enough to easily outrun enemy fighters. It also had to possess exceptional range and endurance. This time around, no design competitions were held. The development was handed straight to Kawanishi. This company eventually brought the concept to life as the E16A1 Zuiun. However, the actual need for such a highly specialized aircraft turned out to be pretty minimal. The Japanese fleet's priorities shifted rapidly. Out of the entire planned class of flotilla leaders, which were supposed to be the Oyoto-class light cruisers, they only managed to complete the lead ship. And the airplane itself was so technologically complex that they could never quite iron out all the bugs. Because of this, the Zuyun's production run was limited to a modest batch of just 15 airframes. Historians seriously doubt that these aircraft ever saw actual combat. At the very least, not a single photo has surfaced showing the airplane with active operational markings. This is despite rumors of its testing in the Palau Islands that just keep circulating from one source to another. The second seaplane slated for development under the 14 Sure program was intended to be the successor to the E16A1 long-range reconnaissance floatplane. Interestingly enough, at that point, the E16A1 had not even entered production yet. The new requirement did not just ask for a slightly upgraded version of its predecessor. Instead, the Navy demanded a design based on two existing aircraft right out of the gate. These were the previously mentioned three-seat E16A and the two-seat E12A, whose development had been canceled earlier that same year. The Japanese admirals just could not let go of their dream of the perfect aircraft, so they decided to combine the strike capability of the E12A with the impressive range of the E16A. As a result, the ambitious 14 Shi specification aimed to fuse two entirely different airframes into a single, versatile, and deadly weapon. The new aircraft had to be equipped with forward-firing armament and carry a bomb load of at least 250 kilograms. It needed to be capable of precision dive bombing, It also had to boast a maximum endurance of at least 10 hours. On top of that, the aircraft's size and weight had to allow it to launch easily from a standard 49-foot shipboard powder catapult. Given these strict constraints, the maximum takeoff weight of the future scout plane was capped at roughly 8,800 pounds. Its overall dimensions could not exceed those of its predecessor, the E16A. Naturally, shipboard stowage dictated the need for folding wings. Interestingly, the Navy did not even specify a target top speed or a required crew size at the time. There was not even an official design competition for the new scout plane. According to some sources, the contract was simply handed straight to Aichi. Other accounts suggest the military did not even have time to draft an official requirement. This meant Aichi actually began developing the successor to their previous seaplanes on their own initiative. Supposedly, the engineers were just going off rumors of a new technical specification that had leaked from Naval Aviation Headquarters. Whatever the case, in October 1940, engineers Yoshishiro Matsuo and Yasushiro Ozawa got to work on an entirely new aircraft. They had previously led the design of the E12A and E13A. Internally, it was given the company designation AM-22. By the end of the year, the preliminary designs were presented to the Navy brass and given the green light. Following this, in January 1941, the military finally issued an official specification. They essentially copied the requirements straight from the already drafted AM-22 design by Aichi. In July 1941, even before development was wrapped up, the final requirements were officially formalized. The first AM-22 prototype rolled out in May 1942. It was then that it received its official military designation. This was the Experimental 2-Seat Reconnaissance Seaplane Type 14. The new aircraft featured a rugged, all-metal construction. The only exceptions were the wooden wingtips and fabric-covered control surfaces. Powering the aircraft was a Mitsubishi Kinse engine producing 1,300 horsepower. The initial armament consisted of two forward-firing 7.7mm machine guns in the wings. There was also another 7.7mm machine gun on a flexible mount in the rear cockpit for tail defense. Mounted securely under the wings were two massive floats. These were attached to the fuselage with heavy-duty metal struts. To make the seaplane easier to stow on cramped ship decks, the wings could be folded upward. The designers decided to drop the third crew member used on the previous E13A. This made the aircraft a bit more compact. It shifted the gunner and observer duties entirely onto the navigator. Interestingly, on this particular aircraft, the pilot was designated as the aircraft commander. This was highly unusual. In Japanese naval aviation at the time, the observer was traditionally in command. To allow the aircraft to bomb effectively during a steep dive, the AM-22 was equipped with dedicated dive brakes. This was a first in Japanese seaplane design. Previous models that were capable of dive bombing, like the E8N2 and F1M2, lacked these types of brakes. Previously, pilots kept their speed down in a steep dive simply by lowering the flaps and adjusting the propeller pitch. Plus, the older models were biplanes. Their natural drag kept the aircraft from overspeeding in a dive. This time, however, the designers had to incorporate dive brakes. They placed them in a highly unusual spot. They were not on the wings, as is standard practice, but right on the front float struts. Each strut featured two metal plates on either side. Actuated hydraulically, they would open outward into the slipstream to slow the aircraft down. The engineers justified this unique setup. They argued they did not want to weaken the wing structure with extra cutouts and mechanisms. They preferred to maintain a clean aerodynamic profile. Frankly, to a modern observer, that argument does not sound very convincing. This is especially true considering that massive, drag-inducing floats were hanging right underneath this so-called clean wing. The next two prototypes received an increased wingspan. It extended from 41.7 to 42 feet. These aircraft were primarily used to test different dive brake configurations. The initial solid brake plates created dangerous aerodynamic vibrations in flight, known as buffeting. To fix this, the new prototypes featured perforated brake plates. This allowed air to pass through and smooth out the airflow. Additionally, these prototypes were fitted with the armament planned for the production models. This included two wing-mounted 20mm cannons with 100 rounds each. It also included a single 13mm machine gun mounted in the rear cockpit for tail defense. For its bomb load, the aircraft could carry a single 250-kilogram bomb on a centerline rack under the fuselage. Alternatively, it could carry 4 smaller 60-kilogram bombs under the wings. There was a catch, however. Dropping bombs in a steep dive of up to 60 degrees was only permitted in pairs and exclusively from the wing racks. The centerline mount lacked a bomb displacement crutch to swing the ordnance clear of the propeller arc. Because of this, dropping the heavy 250-kilogram bomb could only be done in level flight. It could also be done in a shallow dive of no more than 30 degrees. Later on, the AM-22 prototypes were classified as the experimental Type 16 reconnaissance seaplane. During fleet trials, the aircraft received the official designation E16A1. Testing of the first 3 prototypes proceeded at a fairly leisurely pace. It stretched over a year and a half, from May 1942 to August 1943. That was when this brand new reconnaissance aircraft was officially accepted into service. Alongside its official Navy designation, the E16A1, the seaplane finally received its proper name. It was called the Zuyun Model 11. In Japanese, this poetically translates to auspicious cloud. The production versions of the E16A1 were easy to spot by their perforated dive brakes. On the initial production aircraft, these featured 4 rows of round cutouts. Later on, the designer shifted to a single row of large oval slots. Engineers also slightly tweaked the cockpit glazing and improved the flap deployment mechanism. The first aircraft rolling off the assembly line were powered by Mitsubishi Kinsei Model 51 engines. These were later swapped out for the newer Kinsei Model 54, though it produced the exact same power. Full-scale production kicked off in January 1944. In total, the Japanese built 252 of these seaplanes. The vast majority, 193 aircraft, rolled out of the Aichi plant. Another 59 were built at the Nippon Hikoki factory. That number does not even include the first 3 prototypes and a single experimental E16A2 Model 12. That final variant boasted a much more powerful Mitsubishi Kinsei Model 62 engine. It delivered an impressive 1,560 horsepower. The arrival of this new seaplane in combat units coincided with a fascinating phase for the Imperial Japanese Navy. This phase involved the creation of unique aviation hybrid ships. These ships were designed specifically to carry these seaplane bombers. One of these ships was the heavy cruiser Mogami. She had taken serious damage during the Battle of Midway in June 1942. American dive bombers had dropped 6 heavy bombs on her. This completely destroyed 2 of her aft main battery turrets. The Japanese command decided they would not just repair the cruiser, they were going to radically rebuild her. They removed the mangled turrets, they replaced them with a short flight deck. This deck featured handling rails that led straight to a pair of shipboard catapults. Down in the former shell rooms, they installed aviation fuel tanks and bomb magazines. The plan was for the overhauled cruiser to carry up to 11 of the brand new Zuyun seaplanes. The rebuilt ship returned to active duty in May 1943. But at that point, the new aircraft simply were not ready for action, and the Navy was not going to wait around. The unique aviation cruiser was pushed back into service as a standard combatant, except now her main battery firepower was slashed by a third. Due to aircraft shortages, the air group on the Mogami was limited to just 7 aircraft. There were 4 E-13A1s and 3 F-1M2 floatplanes. 2 other ships slated to operate the brand new seaplanes were a pair of sister ships. These were the battleships Hyuga and Ise. The decision to convert them into aviation battleships actually stemmed from a tragic accident. In May 1942, during a gunnery exercise, a massive explosion tore through the battleship Hyuga. This completely destroyed one of her aft main battery turrets. However, the final push for these radical fleet conversions came from the crushing Japanese defeat at Midway. The Empire had lost 4 fleet carriers all at once. They desperately needed to make up for those losses. Considering all this, the Naval Command decided to convert these 2 old World War I-era sister battleships into conventional aircraft carriers. The original plan called for each ship to carry a massive air wing of 54 aircraft. However, they had to scrap that ambitious idea pretty quickly. In practice, the sheer scale of the conversion was almost the same as building a brand new fleet carrier from scratch. Strapped for time and resources, the top brass had to scramble for a simpler and cheaper alternative. For almost a year, the fate of the battleships Hyuga and Ise hung in limbo. The big gun traditionalists and aviation pioneers could not reach an agreement. They were locked in a bureaucratic tug-of-war. Eventually, they struck a bizarre compromise. This resulted in two unique naval hybrids that we now call aviation battleships or battleship carriers. To be honest, they never really cut it as true carriers. At the same time, their traditional battleship firepower dropped by a third. This happened because 4 of their 12 main guns were permanently removed. The massive overhaul officially began on February 23, 1943. That was the day both capital ships headed into dry dock to get the work started. To free up space, crews ripped out the aft number 5 and 6 main battery turrets right down to their barbettes. They also removed the secondary armament. Over that empty space on the stern, they built a 230-foot flight deck. The area underneath was converted into a massive hangar. It was nearly 20 feet high and 131 feet long. Forward, the hangar was 92 feet wide. It tapered down to just 36 feet near the stern. That is where engineers installed a T-shaped aircraft elevator. It was capable of lifting more than 13,000 pounds. The hangar could comfortably house 9 aircraft. Another 11 were meant to be parked up top on the flight deck. Amidships, extending out over the sides, they mounted 2 massive 82-foot gunpowder catapults on tall rotating pedestals. These could launch aircraft weighing up to 11,000 pounds. As a bonus, 1 aircraft could be kept on standby on each catapult. All told, the total air group of the ship was supposed to consist of 22 aircraft. During the redesign, they had to scrap the idea of conventional deck takeoffs. Space was so incredibly tight that there was a high risk of damaging nearby parked aircraft, and landing a conventional wheeled aircraft on a deck that short was physically impossible. Because of this, operational doctrine was strict. All launches had to be made using the catapults. After finishing their combat missions, the aircraft could not return to the ship. They had to recover on conventional fleet carriers or at the nearest land base. To maneuver aircraft around the deck, engineers laid down 2 sets of rails. Aircraft were mounted on special handling dollies that rolled along these tracks. They also installed 10 flush-mounted turntables on the deck. These were similar to what you would see in a rail yard. Thanks to this system, the deck crew could spin an aircraft on its dolly. They could shift it to the correct track and quickly hustle it over to a catapult. They could also push it to a parking spot or send it down the elevator. For float planes landing on the water, a large folding crane was added to the port quarter to hoist them back on board. 2 other ships slated to operate the brand new seaplanes were a pair of sister ships. These were the battleships Hyuga and Ise. The decision to convert them into aviation battleships actually stemmed from a tragic accident. In May 1942, during a gunnery exercise, a massive explosion tore through the battleship Hyuga. This completely destroyed one of her aft main battery turrets. However, the final push for these radical fleet conversions came from the crushing Japanese defeat at Midway. The Empire had lost 4 fleet carriers all at once. They desperately needed to make up for those losses. Considering all this, the Naval Command decided to convert these 2 old World War I-era sister battleships into conventional aircraft carriers. The original plan called for each ship to carry a massive air wing of 54 aircraft. However, they had to scrap that ambitious idea pretty quickly. In practice, the sheer scale of the conversion was almost the same as building a brand new fleet carrier from scratch. Strapped for time and resources, the top brass had to scramble for a simpler and cheaper alternative. For almost a year, the fate of the battleships Hyuga and Ise hung in limbo. The big gun traditionalists and aviation pioneers could not reach an agreement. They were locked in a bureaucratic tug-of-war. Eventually, they struck a bizarre compromise. This resulted in 2 unique naval hybrids that we now call aviation battleships, or battleship carriers. To be honest, they never really cut it as true carriers. At the same time, their traditional battleship firepower dropped by a third. This happened because 4 of their 12 main guns were permanently removed. The massive overhaul officially began on February 23, 1943. That was the day both capital ships headed into dry dock to get the work started. To free up space, crews ripped out the aft number 5 and 6 main battery turrets right down to their barbettes. They also removed the secondary armament. Over that empty space on the stern, they built a 230-foot flight deck. The area underneath was converted into a massive hangar. It was nearly 20 feet high and 131 feet long. Forward, the hangar was 92 feet wide. It tapered down to just 36 feet near the stern. That is where engineers installed a T-shaped aircraft elevator. It was capable of lifting more than 13,000 pounds. The hangar could comfortably house 9 aircraft. Another 11 were meant to be parked up top on the flight deck. Amidships, extending out over the sides, they mounted 2 massive 82-foot gunpowder catapults on tall rotating pedestals. These could launch aircraft weighing up to 11,000 pounds. As a bonus, 1 aircraft could be kept on standby on each catapult. All told, the total air group of the ship was supposed to consist of 22 aircraft. During the redesign, they had to scrap the idea of conventional deck takeoffs. Space was so incredibly tight that there was a high risk of damaging nearby parked aircraft. And landing a conventional wheeled aircraft on a deck that short was physically impossible. Because of this, operational doctrine was strict. All launches had to be made using the catapults. After finishing their combat missions, the aircraft could not return to the ship. They had to recover on conventional fleet carriers or at the nearest land base. To maneuver aircraft around the deck, engineers laid down 2 sets of rails. Aircraft were mounted on special handling dollies that rolled along these tracks. They also installed 10 flush-mounted turntables on the deck. These were similar to what you would see in a rail yard. Thanks to this system, the deck crew could spin an aircraft on its dolly. They could shift it to the correct track and quickly hustle it over to a catapult. They could also push it to a parking spot or send it down the elevator. For float planes landing on the water, a large folding crane was added to the port quarter to hoist them back on board. The old magazines for the No. 5 turret ended up being the perfect spot to store aerial bombs and ammunition. Meanwhile, down in the former No. 6 turret magazines, engineers installed massive storage tanks for aviation fuel. The flight deck itself had some pretty solid protection. It was covered in a layer of heavy-duty concrete about 8 inches thick. That heavy concrete served another critical purpose too. It acted as ballast, compensating for the massive weight of the guns that had just been stripped off the stern. The massive overhaul of both ships was finally wrapped up by August 1943. However, it took almost another full year before High Command finally decided exactly what kind of aircraft to deploy on them. Right up until May 1944, Hyuga and Ise just could not seem to find their place in the strategic plans of the Imperial Japanese Navy. The admirals only had a hazy idea of what to actually do with these lumbering naval hybrids. Because of this, both battleships spent a long time relegated to the mundane role of training ships. They also acted as giant transports ferrying troops and materiel. That dragged on until May 1st, when the 2 hybrids were finally assigned to the 3rd Fleet. Specifically, they joined Carrier Division 4, the 4th Koku Sentai. There, they found themselves alongside the conventional aircraft carriers Junyo and Ryuho. This entire heavy-hitting task force was placed under the command of Rear Admiral Chiaki Matsuda. As mentioned earlier, the original plan of the Japanese command was to equip both of these unusual hybrid ships with a potent air group. They would carry 22 Suisei dive bombers each. These aircraft were specially modified for launch from heavy shipboard catapults. This specific variant was designated the D4Y2 Kai. It was developed specifically for this role and built in very limited numbers. The tactical concept for these aircraft was pretty ambitious. The plan was for each catapult on the ship to launch a bomber every 2 minutes. At that rapid pace, the entire air group of the battleship would be airborne just 22 minutes after the first launch. But there was one major catch. It was physically impossible to safely recover a high-speed aircraft on the incredibly short flight deck of the battleship. Because of this, pilots returning from combat missions had to find other places to land. They had to either land on conventional aircraft carriers or fly all the way to distant land bases. However, when Rear Admiral Chiaki Matsuda took command of both hybrid ships in the spring of 1944, he immediately spotted a glaring flaw in this plan. The admiral rightly pointed out that in real combat conditions, aircraft must launch directly into the wind. That meant in order to use both catapults alternately, the massive battleship would have to maneuver. It would need to catch the wind on one side, then the other, every 60 seconds. Obviously, pulling that off in rough seas or under enemy fire was completely unrealistic. As a result, in the heat of an actual naval battle, launching the entire air group could drag on for over an hour. Because of this obvious oversight, Command decided to completely overhaul their tactics. Now, they wanted at least some of the aircraft to be able to return directly to their parent ship. The only viable solution was to use high-speed floatplanes. They could simply land on the water alongside the battleship, where a heavy shipboard crane would hoist them back onto the deck. The brand new Japanese E16A1 floatplane bomber was absolutely perfect for this role. When it came to key performance specs like top speed, maneuverability, and bomb payload, this aircraft was every bit as capable as older carrier dive bombers like the Aichi E16A2. And in terms of operational range, the new floatplane actually outperformed them by a wide margin. This made it the ideal candidate for naval reconnaissance and strike operations. So by the early summer of 1944, the final air group complements for these unique hybrid battleships, Hyuga and Ise, were officially approved. The breakdown looked like this. Hyuga would carry 8 of the new E16A1 floatplane bombers and 14 D4Y2 Kai dive bombers. Over on her sister ship, Ise, the ratio was flipped. She took on 14 Zuyun floatplanes and 8 conventional Suisei bombers. That being said, when it came to actually loading these aircraft, the historical records vary a bit. If you go by official Japanese documents from August 1944, both ships were assigned the exact same complement. They each received 12 Suisei dive bombers and 10 Zuyun floatplanes. However, during his post-war interrogations, Rear Admiral Chiaki Matsuda gave a different account. He stated that each battleship carried exactly 11 aircraft of each type. They were laid out very methodically too. Half of the aircraft were secured inside the ship's internal hangar, while the other half were spotted up on the flight deck, ready to go. The actual formation of these unusual air groups began in mid-June 1944. Shortly after, on June 23rd, the first officially documented launch of the new Zuyun floatplanes from the ship's catapults took place in the waters off Hiroshima. It is worth pointing out, though, that there is evidence of earlier testing. According to those reports, back in the second half of 1943, the battleships finished their massive conversions and returned to the fleet. Right after that, test launches of older Aichi D16A1 dive bombers were carried out from their catapults. As for the pilots, the air crews assigned to the brand new E16A1s went through an accelerated training course before heading out to the ships. They learned to fly the new aircraft with the 1st Naval Air Group near Yokosuka. This was the very first unit in Japan to receive these modern floatplanes. By mid-August, the 634th Naval Air Group was officially formed. Along with the air crews from Hyuga and Ise, it included carrier groups from the aircraft carriers Junyo and Ryuho. By late-war Japanese standards, this was a massive force. It boasted an impressive 130 aircraft of various types. Throughout the summer and into the early fall of 1944, these inexperienced crews went through intensive training. But the situation in the Philippines was rapidly deteriorating. The Japanese High Command urgently activated their defense plan, Operation Shoichi-Go. This would eventually escalate into the massive Battle of Leyte Gulf. This battle unfolded on October 24th and 25th, 1944. Unfortunately, before the operation kicked off, time simply ran out to fully train these carrier pilots. These young aviators could basically keep their planes in the air. But launching and recovering on a flight deck required a completely different, much higher level of airmanship. Sending green pilots like that into actual naval combat was an exercise in futility. It effectively amounted to suicide. As a result, the decision was made to pull all the aircraft from this massive air group off the ships and move them ashore. After that, the aircraft carriers Junyo and Ryuho quietly survived until the end of World War II. As for the hybrid battleship carriers Hyuga and Ise, they were left completely stripped of their air groups. Despite this, they were assigned to the Northern Force. This task force was under the command of Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa. It was meant to act as a decoy for the American fleet. The battleships served as an anti-aircraft screen for 4 other carriers. The Japanese had somehow managed to scrape together just over 100 partially trained crews for them. The flight decks on these ships were now completely useless for their original purpose, so they just bolted extra anti-aircraft guns directly onto them. Admiral Ozawa's force executed its mission perfectly, successfully drawing away the American fast carriers. Hyuga and Ise miraculously survived that hellish battle. They spent the rest of the war idling at the Kure naval base. This lasted until the summer of 1945, when American aircraft finally sank them in shallow water. But let us get back to the star of our story, the Japanese E16A floatplane. By the time those inexperienced crews were pulled from the ships, this composite air group had gone through a major reorganization. It evolved from a chaotic mix of aircraft of all different types and roles. It became a dedicated seaplane group. Now, its core was made up exclusively of the new E16A1 seaplane bombers. These carried the name Zuyun. Organizationally, all floatplanes of this type were assigned to the 301st Reconnaissance Squadron. This squadron, in turn, reported directly to the larger air group. The Japanese command made a strategic decision. They reassigned these brand new floatplane bombers exclusively to night operations. Everyone knew the reality during the day. With Allied air power completely dominating the skies, the slower floatplanes simply would not stand a chance. The crews of 22 Zuyun aircraft were transferred off their ships. They completed their final night attack training at Ibusuki Air Base in Kagoshima Prefecture. This happened during August and September 1944. By mid-October, they flew out to the Philippines. The squadron's new home was the former American naval facility at Cavite. This was situated on the island of Luzon, right on the coastline of Manila Bay. The Japanese renamed the base Kanakaw. It quickly grew into the largest naval seaplane hub in the entire archipelago. This is where the new Aichi floatplane received its baptism of fire. It was known to the Allies by the reporting name Paul. Initially, Japanese defense plans for the Philippines called for a dedicated reconnaissance squadron. The bulk of the air group would act as a strike unit. However, a severe shortage of operational aircraft made these plans impossible to execute. As a result, the group's total strength never exceeded 25 aircraft. Any division into distinct units existed only on paper. Every aircraft operated out of the same base, flying side by side on the exact same combat missions. Lieutenant Commander Imura was appointed to command this combined force. In reality, though, it took a while before they could actually test the strike capabilities of the Zuyun in combat. While Japanese high command debated how best to utilize this new equipment, Allied aviation started putting intense pressure on the Kanakaw base. This forced the Japanese to scatter their aircraft immediately just to prevent them from being wiped out. Some of the combat aircraft were transferred to a small, heavily camouflaged seaplane base at Tacloban. This base was located along San Pedro Bay on the northern coast of Leyte. Unfortunately for the Japanese, even these countermeasures did not stop Allied pilots from finding their targets. They reduced the Japanese air group by another 10 aircraft, strafing them at their moorings. Nearly a month passed. It was only when Japanese aviation losses in the Philippines reached truly catastrophic levels that the command made a desperate decision. They decided to commit every airworthy aircraft straight into the fight. The first combat mission for the 634th Naval Air Group took place on the night of November 23rd. A squadron of 17 Zuyun floatplanes attacked American troops that had just come ashore near Tacloban. But the mission came at a steep price. American night fighters and heavy anti-aircraft fire shot down 3 Japanese aircraft. Just a few days later, on the night of November 25th, 4 E-16A floatplanes launched to patrol the waters of Layman Bay, east of Manila. This time, the crews had better luck, and all aircraft returned to base safely. The following night, however, proved disastrous. 12 Zuyuns were dispatched on a major bombing and strafing raid against Allied transport ships in Leyte Gulf. The cost of this sortie was steep. The Japanese lost 7 aircraft in a single engagement. Whether they inflicted any significant damage on the enemy remains unconfirmed. By November 29th, only 6 operational aircraft remained on the flight line. Regardless, they were immediately sent back into action. They attacked enemy landing craft in the narrow Kanagaw Channel. That desperate strike cost them yet another aircraft. In early December, the exhausted remnants of the 634th Naval Air Group had to be temporarily withdrawn from the front lines to refit. That reprieve, however, was brief. By the middle of the month, evidently after receiving replacement aircraft and crews, the unit re-entered the fray. Overnight, on December 11th and 12th, the PALs launched a surprise strike on American landing forces entrenched on the western coast of Leyte. On December 15th, they struck again, but this time targeting American positions on the coast of the neighboring island of Panay. On December 21st, 11 Zuyuns attacked a group of American ships near the city of San Jose. American fighters intercepted the formation and shot down 4 Japanese floatplanes. However, one of the crippled aircraft went into a steep dive. It crashed directly into the American transport ship Juan de Fuca, causing severe damage. On the night of December 26th, another flight of E16A aircraft headed for San Jose. Their targets were the local Army Air Force's airfield and a flotilla of American patrol boats anchored just off the beach. The Japanese strafed them with their wing cannons. Furthermore, Japanese records claim they managed to shoot down an American night fighter during the sortie. This aerial victory was credited to the crew of Ensign Heijiro Miyamoto and his gunner, Hiroshi Nakajima. In his personal diary, which miraculously survived the war, Miyamoto recalled sneaking up on the enemy aircraft from below and behind. He then fired a devastating burst from his wing cannons at point-blank range. According to him, this swift attack completely severed the left wing and engine from the twin-engine American aircraft. Incredible as it sounds, American archives actually corroborate this. On that fateful night, a P-61 Black Widow night fighter from the 418th Night Fighter Squadron vanished without a trace. Second Lieutenant Eugene Francis Killey was at the controls. While this loss is not definitive proof of a kill for Miyamoto's crew, the timing is hard to ignore. On December 29th and 30th, 1944, and later on January 2nd, 1945, the Zuyuns kept up their daring raids on targets around San Jose. According to Japanese reports, during a night raid on January 30th north of Island Island, they managed to hit an American transport ship with a 250-kilogram bomb. They claimed it rolled over and quickly sank. However, American records paint a slightly different picture. That night, the Liberty ship S. Simeon G. Reed, anchored just offshore, did suffer a direct hit. Fortunately, the ship had finished unloading its cargo earlier that day. This prevented heavy casualties among the troops and crew. Also, the shallow water kept the massive vessel from fully sinking. On January 13, 1945, the few surviving aircraft of the 634th Naval Air Group were urgently evacuated from the collapsing Philippine front to Taiwan. They settled at a base in East Harbor. There, the Zuyun crews finally got a chance to catch their breath after the grueling Philippine campaign. The unit received long-awaited replacements, and the pilots shifted to routine patrol missions over Taiwan's southern coast. But this relative peace was short-lived. In March 1945, with the epic Battle of Okinawa looming, the air group was rushed back to Japan. They deployed to an airbase near Konya in Kagoshima Prefecture. From there, the pilots immediately threw themselves back into combat. They were desperately trying to blunt the massive American invasion fleet. The Zuyuns continued to operate primarily at night. This simple but effective tactic kept them clear of enemy fighters and deadly anti-aircraft fire. Furthermore, Japanese command was still pragmatic enough not to throw slow floatplanes into daytime attacks against major warships. These capital ships were protected by a dense screen of anti-aircraft fire, and combat air patrols made up of dozens of fast fighters. Instead, the Japanese pilots focused on softer targets, like transport ships and small landing craft. These tactics allowed the Zuyun crews to operate with relatively low losses, at least compared to the staggering attrition rates of conventional Japanese bomber and fighter units. As a result, the floatplane unit remarkably maintained its combat effectiveness almost until the final days of World War II. Throughout the spring of 1945, the floatplanes of the 634th Kokutai flew regular night missions over the Okinawa area. These operations ran from late March through late May. They turned every single night into a grueling test for the crews. Today, we can mostly gauge the success of these operations from the personal diary of Lieutenant Junior Grade Heijiro Miyamoto. He piloted one of the E16A floatplanes. It is worth noting that, like many Japanese aviators at the time, the combat reports of Miyamoto were highly prone to overclaiming. Still, they offer a fascinating first-hand look at the campaign through the eyes of a Japanese pilot. Here are a few standout entries from his diary. On March 29th, the young lieutenant flew a reconnaissance mission to the Okinawa area. There, he spotted an enemy task force. This included 1 battleship, 1 cruiser, and 7 destroyers. Without a second thought, he pushed into an attack against the battleship. According to his report, he successfully hit the ship with 2 60-kilogram bombs. On April 20th, the pilot spotted 2 large transport ships. In his report, he stated he sank one of them with a massive 250-kilogram bomb. On May 20th, while flying south of Ishima, he spotted another destroyer escorting a group of transports. Once again, he claimed a major success. He reported that one of the transport ships was destroyed. The most dramatic entry is dated May 23rd. Just north of that same island of Aishima, Heijiro spotted a massive enemy fleet formation. It included 2 battleships and about a dozen other vessels. This was alongside a second group consisting of 8 destroyers and roughly 50 transport ships. The Japanese pilot desperately pushed through a heavy barrage of anti-aircraft fire to make his attack. His gunner, Hiroshi Nakajima, was seriously wounded by shrapnel. Despite this, the crew pressed the attack. They allegedly managed to sink an American destroyer. For this incredible mission, the pilot was immediately recommended for a promotion. The wounded gunner, Hiroshi, received the prestigious Tokubetsu Korosho citation. It sounds like a script for a Hollywood movie, but there is just one catch. Absolutely none of these spectacular victories can be verified by United States Navy records. Heijiro Miyamoto never got the chance to receive his new rank. On June 11th, the remnants of his naval air group were transferred to the Sakurajima Air Base. And on June 26, 1945, the Zuyun aircraft piloted by Heijiro, with Hiroshi as his gunner, disappeared forever. This happened during another combat mission to Okinawa, but the story of these aircraft does not end there. In addition to the 634th Naval Air Group, in February 1945, E16A1 Zuiun floatplanes began arriving at the 801st Naval Air Group. This group was primarily made up of heavy flying boats. A separate unit, the 302nd Squadron, was formed out of this group. And although on paper it was considered a strictly reconnaissance squadron, in reality, its main job became flying night attack missions. These aircraft were based on Kyushu. From there, they regularly flew out to harass American ships near Okinawa. By late spring, the Japanese command decided to disperse the floatplanes of this squadron across various air bases on Kyushu. This was done just to make them a harder target to destroy on the ground. From there, they kept launching their desperate attacks. In June and July 1945, the surviving remnants of the 302nd Squadron flew over to the Sakurajima base. There, they joined forces with the equally battered 634th Naval Air Group. This was where the Zuyun crews were gearing up to make their final decisive stand for the Japanese Empire. But the sudden surrender scrapped those plans for good. Another fascinating unit that flew these floatplanes during the war was the Katora Naval Air Group. For almost the entire Second World War, it operated as a standard training base preparing young air crews. It was not until May 1945, when things got truly critical, that the group was drastically repurposed to train special attack units. They formed a special attack squadron at the base known as Kaitai 1. It was made up of 18 factory-fresh E16A1 floatplanes. The group was led by Lieutenant Aichi Miyamoto. The plan was simple and brutal. Use these aircraft around Okinawa during the massive Operation Kikusui. This translates from Japanese as floating chrysanthemum. These were meant to be massive, devastating kamikaze strikes against the American fleet. However, despite popular myth and the claims of many historians, these aircraft were never actually intended for those suicide missions. The unit was disbanded almost immediately after it was formed. All those factory-fresh aircraft were simply transferred to the 302nd Squadron as replacements. By the end of the war, there were only a handful of intact E-16A floatplanes left anywhere in the world. United States forces captured one in the Philippines. The aircraft was carefully examined and extensively tested. It was eventually shipped back to the United States for further evaluation. Unfortunately for aviation enthusiasts, not a single Zuyun survives today. And that is a real shame. Both technically and aesthetically, it was one of the most elegant floatplanes in aviation history.